Is that resumption of debate be made an order day for next day of sitting? The member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I move that the words "the next sitting" be omitted with a view to substituting the first sitting in 2018 to allow proper consultation to take place consistent with the commitment made by the government. Mr Deputy Speaker, the fact is that on this government's watch, the Pacific Triangle, the CSL Pacific, the Pioneer, the Lindsay Clark, the Tendara Spirit, the Araluen Spirit, the Alexander Spirit, the British Loyalty, the Hooghly Spirit, the Alexander Spirit, the MV Portland, CSL Melbourne, British Fidelity, CSL Brisbane and CSL Thevenard have all left our shores. They've left our shores and the Australian flag has been lowered. The Australian flag has been lowered and Australian jobs have been lost. This is a government that has been prepared to destroy the Australian shipping industry because of a view that they have that where there are Australian workers who are members of unions, they prefer to have foreign workers being paid foreign wages on foreign flag ships around our coasts. The abuse of the temporary licence system is something that has to be addressed. This government has no plan. Indeed, this is replacing the Australian flag with the white flag when it comes to Australian jobs. On this government's watch, they have allowed temporary licences for work such as the MV Portland, which takes minerals from Western Australia to Portland in Victoria to the smelter, and then the ship returns to Western Australia. A very consistent voyage between two destinations that in no way could be defined as temporary. And yet this government has failed to put in place a mechanism to ensure that the legislation carried by this parliament in 2012 is given a chance to operate. That has led to a loss of Australian jobs. I think this minister, who has his birthday today, I'm told, 50th birthday, isn't too bad a bloke. But he's a part of a bad government. And in this he said this. Another key message from my recent stakeholder consultations is that regulatory certainty, indeed ideally bipartisanship, is essential for investment. And there is. But has there been any briefing for the opposition on this legislation? No, there hasn't been. Has there been an exposure draft of this legislation? No, there hasn't been. Has there been consultation with stakeholders? Have they had the potential to see this legislation? No, there hasn't been. And it stands in stark contrast to the way that we dealt with this when we were in government. In 2007, asking a parliamentary inquiry committee to conduct a comprehensive review. Indeed, I think one that the member for Ballarat played a critical role in. October 2008, it brought down a unanimous bipartisan report that provided the basis for the legislation moving forward. In 2009, we established a shipping policy advisory group comprising shippers, industry and unions, convened in order to implement the committee's recommendations. We released a discussion paper for public comment in 2010, and in 2011 we established 3 industry reference groups to work through the details of the reform package. And in 2011, later this year, we released exposure drafts of the bills for public comment and another roundtable conducted with industry and government officials. And then, of course, we introduced the legislation to the parliament and it was carried by this parliament. At that time, in spite of the extensive consultation, the attempt of bipartisanship, the getting together with industry players, whether they be users of ships or the owners of Australian ships in the shipping industry, to participate in this process. And yet what we have now is legislation being introduced into this parliament consistent with this government's attempts to destroy Australian shipping. We had legislation from the minister's predecessor the former member for Wide Bay and Deputy Prime Minister, that came before this parliament. That's the first legislation I've ever seen that in the explanatory memorandum made it clear that the result of that legislation would be the replacement of the Australian workforce with a foreign workforce. We had Australian businesses such as tourism operators in the Kimberley, being advised by departmental officials that the way that they should go forward and be competitive was to replace the Australian flag on the back of their ships, put a foreign flag on and employ a foreign workforce on foreign wages. An extraordinary admission made by the government officials at that time. I don't blame them. I blame the elected government for that responsibility. And you had Mr Bill Milby give quite extraordinary evidence before the Senate. Extraordinary evidence about the conversations that were taking place when he asked for a briefing of how he could deal with the response to the legislation that was being put forward by the government. So we saw that legislation defeated in the Senate because people of goodwill said that they wouldn't cop this. People like Senator Xenophon, who would normally, as is his practice, grant a second reading amendment so there could be further debate, killed that legislation at that point, refused to allow it to occur. And yet what we have now, in spite of the fact that a birthday boy over here was prepared to say comments like, at a Shipping Australia Limited Annual Review, January 2017, I'm acutely aware of the need to work in a bipartisan way. But we're not seeing that happen. Of course, the euphemism of some of the industry bodies like Shipping Australia, which is actually the foreign ships, shows that they know that Australians want to see an Australian shipping industry because it's in the interests of our economy, it's in the interests of our environment, and it's in the interests of our national security. The minister at the table speaks about stopping boats quite regularly. Well, this legislation and this government's approach has been to stop ships and boats with the Australian flag on it and replace it with foreign ships around the coast that of course enter into our harbours with not the same migration or security checks that Australian workers have to go through in order to get their MSIC cards. So we have very clearly put forward a preparedness to sit down with the minister and to work through these issues, because certainty is required for legislation to produce the outcomes of intention, which is a revitalisation of the Australian shipping industry. So I am very disappointed that the minister, in spite of the fact that we received commitments about proper consultation about any legislation before it came into the House, that simply just hasn't happened. It's been abandoned. But once again is another gap between the rhetoric of the government and the reality. And Teresa Lloyd from the industry body, who's overseas, contacted us to tell us that she'd been notified that this legislation was coming in this week, and did we know anything about it? Well, that was how we found out about the legislation. So the industry, the Australian shipping industry, have not been briefed on this bill either. And how hard is it to pick up the phone? We sat last week in Parliament. How hard would it have been to get a proper briefing to allow for some advice before we went forward? So this amendment will allow for that proper consultation to occur, and that's why this amendment should be carried.